The morning they came from my grandfather's bridge, I was standing barefoot on my back porch with a cup of coffee in my hand, watching fog lift off Briar Lake like the whole world was still asleep. Then I heard diesel engines growling through the trees, and before I could even set my mode down, a yellow bulldozer rolled into view, heading straight for the old stone crossing my family had protected for nearly 100 years. That was the moment I realized the people running our neighborhood did not want rules. They wanted ownership, and they had just picked the one fight they were not built to win. My name is Daniel Reeves, and until that summer, I honestly thought I was a pretty reasonable man. I fixed drainage systems for a living. I returned borrowed tools. I waved at people even when they did that awkward half wave where you can tell they forgot your name. My wife, Emily, used to joke that I was the kind of guy who apologized to furniture after bumping into it, which was mostly true. But there are some things a man cannot smile his way through, and watching strangers threaten the only piece of my family history still standing is one of them. That bridge was not fancy in the way rich people use the word fancy. It did not have iron lamps or imported stone or some little bronze plaque paid for by a committee. It was rough limestone, hand-cut and stacked by my great-grandfather, William Reeves, back in 1926, when Briar Lake was still surrounded by cattle pasture, cedar trees, and families who knew each other by the sound of their trucks. He built it after a spring flood washed out the wagon crossing and left half the lakeside cut off for 3 weeks. People still told stories about him working in the rain, sleeves rolled up, hands bleeding, refusing to stop until neighbors could cross safely again. So when I inherited the cabin from my father, that bridge felt less like property and more like a promise. Emily and I had plans, small ones, the kind that do not impress anyone at dinner parties, but mean everything when you are tired of pretending city life is now wearing you down. I was going to repair the roof, rebuild the dock, maybe take fewer contracts, maybe learn how to sit still without checking my phone every 4 minutes. Then Marlene Whitaker moved in across the lake, and Peace packed his bags before I even knew it was leaving. Marlene was the newly elected president of the Briar Point Homeowners Association, a woman who wore white linen to construction meetings and spoke in that soft, polished voice people use when they are about to ruin your day. She had moved in 18 months earlier with her husband Clark, a man who smiled like a dealership commercial and owned half the companies the HOA suddenly started hiring. Their crowd called our side of the lake legacy lots, which sounded respectful, until you heard the way they said it, like legacy meant old, inconvenient, and waiting to be cleared. The first letter arrived on a Friday. Certified mail, thick envelope, serious font. According to the HOA, my bridge violated visual harmony standards, obstructed luxury sightlines, and created a negative impression for prospective investors in the new Briar Pointey Resort project. I read that sentence 3 times, then laughed so hard Emily came in from the kitchen asking what was wrong. Apparently, I told her, holding up the letter, a bridge built before sliced bread is now hurting somebody's brand identity. We thought it was ridiculous. We thought paperwork would fix it. That was our first mistake. I dug through my father's old metal filing cabinet and found surveys, deeds, easements, and one brittle yellow folder labeled Reeves Crossing, 1926. I brought everything to the HOA meeting the following Tuesday, wearing my one decent button-down, trying to act like a neighbor instead of a man walking into an ambush. The community center smelled like burnt coffee, floor cleaner, and money pretending to be manners. Marlene sat at the front table with 5 board members lined beside her like decorative guard dogs. I laid my documents out carefully and explained that the bridge existed long before the HOA, before the resort, before Briar Point was anything but scrubland and mosquitoes. Marlene barely looked down. She just folded her hands, gave me a tight little smile, and said, Mr. Billish, Reeves. Progress always feels personal to people who are standing in its way. I remember the room going quiet after that, not because she had said something wise, but because everyone understood she had just told me I did not belong there anymore. The vote took less than 2 minutes. 6-1 in favor of enforcement, 30 days to remove the bridge, or the HOA would begin daily fines and pursue demolition at my expense. As I walked back to my truck, gravel crunching under my boots, I looked across the lake at the resort cranes rising over the trees, and for the first time I understood what this was really about. Marlene did not hate the bridge because it was unsafe. She hated it because it reminded everyone that our little lake had a history older than her authority, and people like her cannot stand anything they cannot control. The next 2 weeks were when Briar Point stopped pretending this was about community standards and started acting like a little government with a grudge. I got written up for grass that was half an inch too high, a mailbox that was apparently the wrong shade of black, a mailbox that was apparently the wrong shade of black, a garden hose visible from the lane, and, my personal favorite, a canoe paddle leaning against my shed in a manner inconsistent with the visual character of the neighborhood. I stood there reading that one in my driveway, laughing by myself like a man losing a very specific kind of argument with reality. Then I saw the patrol truck parked across the road, two men inside wearing matching gray polos with Whitaker property compliance stitched over the pocket, and suddenly it was not funny anymore. Whitaker, as in Clark Whitaker, Marlene's husband. The HOA was paying her husband's company to circle my property, invent violations, and bill me for the privilege of being harassed. Emily wanted me to call a lawyer right away, but I told her I wanted to understand the machine before I started swinging at it, because machines always have bolts, and if you find the right one, the whole thing starts rattling. So I investigated. I pulled business records, contractor licenses, HOA invoices, meeting minutes, everything I could legally get my hands on. Clark's compliance company had an expired state registration. The emergency maintenance contractor the HOA kept recommending was owned by Marlene's brother. The landscape consultant who called my bridge a blight had installed Marlene's private lake garden, and according to the original boundary survey, about 4 feet of that garden sat on my land. That part gave me a petty little thrill I am not proud of. But I will not lie, I slept better that night. Still, Marlene did not back off. She changed tactics. Suddenly, people at the bait shop went quiet when I walked in. Mrs. Hanley, who used to bring Emily peach cobbler every summer, looked at us like we were carrying a contagious disease. Somebody filed an anonymous safety complaint against the bridge. Then another claimed I was contaminating the lake with runoff chemicals, which was impressive considering I made my living designing drainage systems that prevented exactly that. By then I understood Marlene's plan. She did not need to beat me in court if she could make me too tired, too isolated, and too broke to keep fighting. One rainy Monday, after another certified letter threatened a demolition lien, I drove to the county records office mostly out of stubbornness. The clerk, an older man named Earl who looked like he had personally filed every document since electricity arrived in town, helped me pull anything tied to Briar Lake, the dam, the old crossing, and the Reeves property. I expected easements, maybe a forgotten maintenance agreement. What I found was something else entirely. In a flat archival box, under a map so brittle Earl made me wear cotton gloves, was a 1926 water management agreement signed by my great-grandfather in the county drainage district. William Reeves had not just built a bridge, he had helped design the original spillway and secondary bypass channels that controlled overflow from the lake into Willow Creek. And there it was, in dry legal language that nearly made my hands shake. Perpetual secondary flow authority granted to William Reeves and his heirs for maintenance, flood control, and lake level management. I read those words once, then twice, then I sat back in that metal chair and stared at the ceiling tiles while the rain tapped on the windows like it knew a secret. Marlene had spent months trying to force me off a bridge that was not just a bridge. It was part of the water system. My family did not merely own stone over a creek. We held the legal right to operate the bypass that kept Briar Lake at level. That night, Emily found me at the kitchen table surrounded by copies, maps, highlighters, and a half-eaten sandwich I had forgotten existed. I told her what I had found, expecting relief, but she got quiet. "Daniel," she said, "if you can control the lake, you can hurt more than Marlene." And she was right. The new resort had employees. Boat hands, waitresses, cleaners, maintenance guys, ordinary people trying to pay rent while Marlene played queen of the shoreline. So I did not run to the dam and start turning valves like some movie villain. I called people who knew more than I did. First was Nora Castillo, a water rights attorney out of Austin with a voice calm enough to make bad news sound manageable. She reviewed the documents and said, "Mr. Reeves, I need you to understand this clearly. If these records hold up, the HOA has been threatening a structure tied to legally protected water operations." Then she paused, and I could hear papers shifting on her desk. "They are not poking a homeowner anymore. They are poking federal water law." Next, I called Amos Bell, the retired dam operator who had worked Briar Lake for 34 years. Amos met me at the diner before sunrise, smelled like pipe tobacco and old motor oil, and told me my great-grandfather had been one of the smartest watermen this county ever had. "Those bypass valves still work," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Nobody uses them because nobody remembers they exist." That sentence sat with me all day. Nobody remembers they exist. That was Marlene's weakness. She thought history was decoration. She had no idea it could still move water. At the next HOA meeting, I gave her one last chance. Nora stood beside me, Amos sat in the front row, and Emily squeezed my hand before I stepped up. I offered a simple deal. Preserve the bridge as a historic structure, stop the harassment, audit the HOA contracts, and in return I would sign a lake-level maintenance agreement protecting the resort's opening season. For a second, the room went so still I thought common sense might actually survive. Then Marlene leaned into the microphone, smiled like a blade sliding out of velvet, and said, "We do not negotiate with people who threaten the future of this community." She called for a vote. Her board rejected the offer, 6-2. As I gathered my papers, Amos caught my eye from the front row and gave the smallest nod I had ever seen. It was not approval exactly. It was recognition. Marlene had been offered peace in front of witnesses, and she had chosen war. 2 mornings later, before sunrise had even cleared the pine trees, Amos called me and said, "Daniel, she just tried to buy the wrong man." His voice was low, tired, and angrier than I had ever heard it. Marlene had sent one of Clark's men to offer him $15,000 cash if he would disable the bypass controls and make it look like I had tampered with the dam. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, watching Emily's face change as she realized from my expression that the whole thing had moved from ugly to criminal. Amos had already called the sheriff, Nora had already started drafting an emergency filing, and by noon, Marlene's beautiful little lie was cracking around the edges. But pride is a strange thing. It does not retreat just because the truth shows up. That evening, the HOA sent a final notice declaring me a public safety threat and authorizing private security to prevent unauthorized access to Briar Lake water infrastructure. Unauthorized. That word almost made me laugh because by then Amos had formally retired and recommended me as interim operator under the Reeves Family Water Authority, which meant Marlene's guards could stand there looking expensive, but they could not legally stop me from doing maintenance. The final confrontation happened on a cold Thursday morning with half the county watching. I arrived at the dam with Nora, Amos, Emily, Sheriff Calder, 2 local news crews, 3 resort investors, and a crowd of neighbors who had suddenly remembered they liked history when television cameras were pointed at it. Marlene was already there in a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my first truck, standing in front of the control housing like she had been personally appointed guardian of the American dream. Clark hovered behind her, pale and sweaty, checking his phone every few seconds as if a better version of reality might text him back. "You're not touching that equipment," Marlene said, loud enough for the cameras. "This community will not be held hostage by a bitter man with a grudge." I looked at her for a long second, and I wish I could say I had some perfect movie line ready. But the truth is, I was tired. Tired of letters, tired of whispers, tired of watching people confuse money with morality. So I just said, "Marlene, I gave you every chance to be decent." Nora handed the sheriff the federal filing, the 1926 agreement, Amos's transfer letter, and the maintenance authorization. Sheriff Calder read slowly, the way men do when they know every camera is waiting for their mistake. Then he stepped aside and said, "Mrs. Whitaker, Mr. Reeves has legal authority to proceed." Something in Marlene snapped right there, not loudly at first. It was more like a porcelain cup cracking under hot water. Her smile vanished, her voice sharpened, and she said, "People like him do not belong here. This lake was supposed to be better than this." And there it was, plain as daylight, the truth she had spent months dressing up in rules and safety language. This had never been about a bridge. It was about who got to belong, who got erased, and who got to decide which memories were too ugly for a luxury brochure. I knelt beside the old concrete housing and started loosening the bolts. The wrench rang against metal, clean and sharp, and the whole crowd went quiet. Underneath the cover was the brass wheel Amos had shown me, dark with age but solid as a church bell. "For the record," I said, because Nora told me to narrate everything, "I am opening the secondary bypass for lawful maintenance and flow inspection under the Reeves Water Authority." Then I turned the wheel, once, twice, 3 times, for a few seconds. Nothing happened, and I heard someone behind me whisper, "Is that it?" Then the dam answered. A deep rumble rolled under our feet. Not violent, not wild, just old machinery waking up after being ignored by people who thought new money made them smarter than old engineering. Water surged into the bypass channel, brown and silver in the morning light, and within 20 minutes the lake had begun pulling away from the resort docks. You could see the line drop against the pilings. You could see the investors doing math in their heads. You could see Clark sit down on a concrete block like his legs had resigned. Marlene stared at the receding shoreline, her face empty now, all that polish gone, and whispered, "You cannot do this." I stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and said, "I already offered you a way where nobody had to lose. By sunset, the resort's opening weekend was canceled. The bank had frozen their financing review, and the HOA board was calling emergency meetings without Marlene in the room. I restored normal flow the next day, because this was never about destroying the lake. It was about proving she did not own it. 3 months later, Briar Point reopened under new management. The bridge became part of a protected heritage trail. Clark's contracts were investigated, and Marlene sold her house before the first real summer heat rolled in. Some folks say I went too far. Maybe they are right. Maybe turning a lake into leverage is not the clean kind of justice people like to quote in church. But I know this much. If I had stayed quiet, that bridge would be gone. My family history would be buried under a resort sign, and Marlene would have learned that bullying works as long as you wear pearls while doing it. So I will ask you straight. Was I wrong to use the one legal power I had left? Or was that exactly what justice looks like when every polite option has already failed? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I really want to know where you stand on this one. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA, a neighbor, or some tiny local kingdom that thought rules only applied to everyone else, tell me your story too.